you document. If you could explain what the letter said and whether you've received a response. You've also pointed out that Human Rights Watch for decades has documented Russian war crimes from Chechnya to Syria and now in Ukraine. Has the Russian government responded in the past to requests from Human Rights Watch for responses to incidents that you have documented?
In this letter, we asked about these very specific incidents. We shared with them links to access the drone footage that we reviewed. We asked them to share with us what information there was into why these killings occurred, why these Ukrainian soldiers were executed, and we wanted to know whether there's actually an order that's been put in place, a command telling Russian soldiers to execute Ukrainian soldiers rather than take them prisoners. Of course, a very serious war crime. We did not receive a response to that letter, and as you said, in the sadly decades of our documentation of war crimes committed by Russia, we do not receive substantive responses to our letters at all, and so it really blocks any ability on our side to directly engage with the Russian government and with the Russian army on the abuses that continue to be perpetrated. And what we don't see or we don't know of is any measures being taken by the Russian military to hold its own soldiers accountable when they commit war crimes.
And of course, now Shoigu is out as defense minister. What are you calling on Russia and the United States to do, particularly as both continue to use or provide banned munitions? And let's talk about Secretary of State Tony Blinken in Ukraine this week, where he announced a $2 billion in additional military funding to Ukraine, saying the U.S. is working to quickly get more ammunition and weapons to the front lines.
That is not right.
Is this the answer?
That is not right. They're using Ukraine like a puppet.
Well, here I really want to dive into one very specific issue, which is the issue of banned munitions being used in this war. The particular munition that I'm speaking about are cluster munitions. These are a type of munition that most countries around the world ban the use of absolutely because of the harm they pose to civilians. There's a convention that many states have signed on to. Unfortunately, the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia have not signed the treaty that bans the use of cluster munitions. And since I remember it was in the very first hours of the full-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2022 that we heard about a cluster munitions attack. Only 2 weeks ago, there was a horrifying cluster attack by Russian forces on the city of Odessa. This was at 7 p.m. on a jogger's path. It killed 5 civilians, injured over 30 more, including 2 children and a pregnant woman. And then tying this, of course, to the U.S. has been shipping more cluster munitions, these same munitions, to Ukraine for Ukraine to use. The latest shipment, the 5th shipment of cluster munitions from the United States, was announced in late April, and clearly adding banned munitions, more banned munitions into this conflict is absolutely not the answer, and this is what continues to harm Ukrainian civilians.
Well, Belkis, we want to turn now to a conflict that is very rarely covered, and certainly not covered to the extent that it should be, which is in Sudan, where a humanitarian catastrophe in North Darfur is escalating, as Human Rights Watch has documented. On Wednesday, the United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator for Sudan said people are, quote, trapped in an inferno of brutal violence between the army and paramilitary forces, which has made it hard to deliver aid, and now, quote, famine is closing in for more than 4 million people. Also on Wednesday, the United States imposed sanctions against 2 commanders of Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces. This is human rights lawyer Jamal Abdul Khamis describing how he nearly escaped a massacre orchestrated by the Rapid Security Forces, or RSF. He spoke in a video for a new Human Rights Watch report titled Sudan, Ethnic Cleansing in West Darfur.
Told you.
I was accompanying my injured friend, Youssef Arun Kabalo. Minutes later, around 8 militiamen wearing Rapid Support Forces uniforms appeared. There were others with them from these well-known Arab militias.
militias.
They were arguing with people. They stopped the cars. They opened fire on us. They shot at the chests of children, women, old and young men. It was a harrowing scene. We thought about how to escape. But we needed a way to escape. How were we going to escape?
Working with Netanyahu and the Joe Biden.
They started chasing people down the valley and firing on people who were in the water. It was terrifying.
So, Belkis Villa, that was an excerpt from the video that accompanied your report, Human Rights Watch's report on Sudan. If you could talk about the key findings in the report and why Human Rights Watch has concluded that the RSF may have committed genocide.
So this report is about a period last year between April and June, and then subsequently in November. And we've centered the report around events that occurred in the capital of West Darfur, the city of El Geneina. The reason we focus there is because though there has been fighting across Sudan since last April, when there was a split between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, the violence has been perhaps most acute there. And this is, an area that since 2003 has faced waves of violence and horrific killings. Last April, with this split and fighting that developed in Khartoum, the capital, we saw the RSF proceed to encircle the city of El Geneina, where there was a limited presence of the Sudanese armed forces. They pulled out of the city at that point, leaving civilians in the city to the hands of the RSF. The RSF brought in allied militia, and these allied militia and the RSF then from April until June conducted a rampage of killings, of looting, of torture, of rape, targeting a specific ethnic group, the Masalit population, and a few other specific ethnic groups. And this was a campaign, as you say, of ethnic cleansing that we saw conducted over about 6 weeks. And over that time, these armed forces
to control the
this
region,
population, pushing them into a smaller and smaller sector of the city, and then ultimately pushed them out of the city in one mass wave of killing, where you had tens of thousands of people on the streets, mostly Masalit, walking, trying to get to safety, and Rapid Support Forces along the sides of the road just opening fire and shooting them. People started running, they jumped into the river, which was deep, they were drowning. As they were drowning, they were being shot and killed. Some then turned around and ran in the direction of the border with Chad, and they along that road were also rounded up by forces, and many were killed. At the end of last summer, my colleague and I interviewed dozens of survivors of this violence. We ended up interviewing 200 or so, and they shared with us horrific details about these killings. And it's really important that states focus on the acuteness of this violence and focus on examining whether indeed there was intent to commit genocide by the RSF and whether there should be prosecutions for genocide.
And Belkis Villa, if you can explain who is arming both sides. I mean, we've just passed the first anniversary of this conflict between the Sudanese military and the RSF, who were together before this, and explain who the leaders are in the countries on both sides.
Unfortunately, this is an incredibly murky picture. We have different governments providing arms to either side of these groups. We ourselves have been trying to track some of these arms transfers because, of course, the more that weapons continue to get poured into this conflict, the more the fighting will continue and the more civilians will pay the price. I think what's perhaps the most notable, though, is actually the lack of action to protect civilians, whether that's by the UN Security Council or by the African Union. You know, there was a UN mission of peacekeepers that was based in Sudan, and their mission ended in 2020. A new mission was created by the UN that had no peacekeeping or protection of civilian mandate. It was only a political negotiations mission, but even that closed at the end of last year, last November. So at the moment in Sudan, there is absolutely no entity that is focused on the protection destruction of civilians. And so what we're calling for in this report is a new mission that needs to be created both by the UN and the African Union, sent into Sudan with a mission to protect civilians, and at the same time, we need to see an effective arms embargo.
And the United
Currently,
States.
there's an arms embargo
Didn't they
in
have
place
slaves?
in the context of Darfur. It's not being
Didn't they
complied with, as you said.
kidnap
There are
people
different
from
states
Africa
throwing
and
weapons
brought
into
them
the
in
country,
slaves?
and that
They
needs to
owe
be
us.
complied with
They
in
should
order
be
to
there.
better protect civilians. If I may just
Protecting the
add
civilians.
one thing, which is there is another city, a city in northern Darfur, which you mentioned, El Fasher. That city, as of this morning, is in flames in the eastern part of the city. We saw satellite imagery from 2 days ago showing that the RSF has encircled the city and that there are fires developing in civilian neighborhoods. And this is a city that's been housing tens of thousands of people who've been displaced from fighting in other parts of Darfur.
Bilquis, as you mentioned, there is an existing arms
notice you always hear
embargo.
rape,
So if you could say, I
rape
mean,
in it.
how is an arms embargo normally enforced, and why hasn't it been enforced in this case? And what are the countries that are violating the arms embargo consistently? Outside powers who are involved in this conflict include the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt,
yeah.
and no doubt others.
The United Arab
Absolutely.
Emirates.
So, you know, I mean,
Oh,
the
yeah.
effectiveness of arms embargoes
Another
really
set of
comes also
crooks
from political
that know
will
more than
to
a
impose
Cro-Magnon.
those arms embargoes. Political will on the side of states not
Troglodytes.
to send weapons to specific conflict zones, but then also on the side of the international community, the watchdog community, the UN Security Council, to hold states accountable when they are breaking that arms embargo, and that's something that we're not seeing happening in the context of Darfur specifically. You mentioned the name of a few states like the United Arab Emirates and others that are shipping weapons into
because
this
they're killing
conflict
black
and context.
people.
But as I said, it's extremely murky. There is limited tracking of what kind of weapons are being brought into the country and how they're being used by these warring parties. Exactly the reason that indeed there should be an arms embargo, a complete arms embargo in place
And the
that is
warring
being
parties
effectively
should
enforced
not be
by the
there.
UN and the global community.
And Bilquis,
They're invaders.
if you could say, you know, just outline what the scale of the crisis is for refugees and internally displaced people in Sudan. A new report from the International Organization for Migration has found 20,000 people are forced to flee their homes in Sudan every day. 20,000 people every day,
Imagine that.
half of them children.
Imagine that.
What do you think needs to be done to help these people get to a place that's safe?
As you say, I mean, the scale of the conflict really can't be understated. We have areas in the country that are approaching famine. We have areas of the country like Darfur
Just like in
where
Gaza.
the violence and the conditions have been so bad and the
Here we
violence so
go.
acute
Notice
that
the
over
connection.
500,000
Connect the
people
dots.
have had to flee across
Look
the
at the
border
map.
into Chad. We've
Look at
seen
where all
many
these
people have
countries
to
are
flee to other
on
neighboring
the map,
countries,
and you
including
make the
South
connection of
Sudan
famine
and
and the
elsewhere. So it
bestiality,
really speaks to the horrifying situation that civilians are facing. Unfortunately, as long as the fighting continues and as long
This
as
is
there is no
orchestrated.
entity to put in place,
Systematic
a civilian
orchestration.
protection
Period.
strategy, we're going to continue to see the conditions that you're describing. There are so many areas that are completely outside of the access of aid groups and aid workers. So those are areas where there's no way to bring food or medicine or water in, and that's because of the warring parties. The RSF and the Sudanese armed forces are blocking access for aid workers into these areas. They're blocking civilians from fleeing from certain areas, and that's really the context of the conditions you described.
Bilquis Villa, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Associate Director with the Crisis, Conflict, and Arms Division at Human Rights Watch, speaking to us from the capital of Ukraine, from Kyiv. And speaking of international human rights, the International Court of Justice today is hearing from South Africa their request over the Israeli assault on Gaza's southern city of Rafah. We'll have more on that tomorrow. I'm Amy Goodman.